guy is sensitive. I've got a stain here. I don't know where it came from. I hugged somebody. I bet that's what that is. Probably some makeup. All right, I don't know why it was making popping noises, but maybe that was the microphone's way of saying, hey folks, let's get in here, let's start class. Maybe that was it. Good morning. Boy, gets quiet. It's kind of like when Jacob leaves a room and it just gets deathly quiet. What just happened? How did that happen? So we are in Colossians chapter 2. It's only 4 chapters, and this is lesson 6, how we're breaking up Colossians, and there's a total of 10. So how are we going to go through the rest of July and all of August? Well, this is how. I'm going to be gone for the next 2 weeks. I know, just really distraught about that. So I'm going to teach this morning, and then we're going to start chapter 3 in 2 weeks from today. The next 2 Sundays, Shane is going to be doing his Proverbs class, both Sunday morning and Sunday night, and that's reflected on the schedule out there. I also want to make a remark regarding some of our prodigal members. Dwayne and Jodine have finally made it back home. I told them I was this close to ripping them out of the directory, but they came back. So, wow, I'm glad y'all are back with us. Glad everyone is here. Talked to some of you, and everyone says, hey, I'm feeling pretty good. Well, let me ask you this as we begin this lesson. How do you feel spiritually? Do you feel spiritually fulfilled? What Paul is going to be talking about in this lesson is people looking for something more than Jesus. And you remember how Paul began this letter? He began with the real deal. Remember that $100 bill I showed you last week? And then there was another one that was, slightly altered. Yeah, some of you are saying, yeah, I remember that. The point is, Jesus is the real deal. Anything else is a counterfeit. And so Paul begins by showing the real deal because as he gets into chapter 2, verse 6, he begins talking about all the counterfeits. And that conversation continues. So what do we need more than Jesus? What is it that is going to make us more fulfilled, more in our worship, feel like we're missing out on something, or in our daily lives, we're missing out on something. And there may be some things that we can do to make things more meaningful and helpful for us. But Paul is writing to people who are new Christians. This is a church he's never been to, and he is very concerned because there are people coming in saying, yeah, Christianity is great, but let's add to it. Let's add some stuff to it. And that's what's often called the Colossian heresy. In chapter 2, there's a series of commands, and the first one we looked at last week, see to it that no one takes you captive. How? Through hollow and deceptive philosophy. Does that sound like Christianity to you? Does that sound like the pure, unadulterated Word of God? Hollow and deceptive philosophy. That's not Christ. That's counterfeit. Don't let anyone take you captive, he says. And then in the verses we're going to be looking at this morning, there are 2 additional commands. Do not let anyone judge you. Do not let anyone disqualify you. And so we're going to start this morning by looking at verses 16 and 17. So this is all part of the larger context, really going back to verse 6. And this is, he starts it off by saying, I just talked to you about Jesus. Walk in Jesus. Verse 6. And don't let anyone take you captive by hollow and deceptive philosophy. As we come to verse 16, the next command, don't let anyone judge you, is how the most translations render it. Verse 16, pass judgment on you. All right. As we move into this section, I want to remind you of this verse, and here it's graphically portrayed. You have been filled in him who is the head of the church. Well, that's true. Jesus is the head of the church. But what does this verse say? All rule and authority. What did Jesus say as he was about to ascend? Matthew 28, verse 18. All authority has been given to me. He is King of kings and Lord of lords. So yes, Jesus is the head of his church. That is absolutely true. In verse 19, we'll mention the head, from whom the whole body, and we know he's talking about the church. What does it mean to be filled in him? What does that mean? We're complete, okay. Say that again. All right, so Jesus, we are in Jesus and he is in us. All right, spiritually complete. Be more specific in that regard. But it affects our lives. We can't really separate our spiritual body, our spiritual existence from our physical existence. And we have been filled in him. We are not going to be taken in by what the world has to offer. The question we asked last week, why would I want what the world has to offer when I can have pure, unadulterated Christianity ruling in my life, overflowing in my life? So do you feel spiritually fulfilled? Do you need something more than the gospel? That's the question I want us to think about as we go through this lesson. All right, so let's continue the discussion from last week. Do not let anyone pass judgment on you, verses 16 through 19. Do not let anyone disqualify you, verses 20 through 23. Okay, do not let anyone pass judgment on you. Let's read verses 16 and 17, and then we will discuss them. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. All right, you see that word, therefore. What does that suggest to us? That it connects with the previous material, and he's going a step further with it. And so how does this relate to the previous material? Well, he was talking about the false, the Colossian heresy, as it's often called. Paul doesn't call it that. And how through Jesus we have the real deal. We must not lose sight of that. And so therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. So what does it mean to judge someone? I think we have a pretty good idea, or pass judgment on you. They kind of look down their spiritual noses at you. Say, you don't measure up. What's wrong with you? Do people in the world do that to us? Okay. Do fellow Christians do that to other Christians? Yes. Oh, I got some nods there. Oh, yeah. Not me. I don't do that. Remember the older brother in Luke 15? What was he doing to his younger brother who had blown it? That's a different situation, different context. Well, he was judging his brother harshly instead of rejoicing in his return. Don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. Have we heard Paul discuss something like this before? Okay. Chronologically, what was the previous letter that Paul just wrote? Well, it's been a couple years. He's been in prison. But what was the last letter that Paul wrote that we studied last quarter? Romans. Romans 14 talks about judging people in regard to what they eat or what they drink. But then he adds this, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. What are these? What is Paul talking about here? And you see, he's talking about eating and drinking and associating that with... Okay, so how do you know that this isn't talking about pagan practices? How do you know he's not saying... So what is he talking about? Let me go back here a second. A religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. Are those Jewish celebrations? All right, look at verse 17. I'm going to highlight it here in a moment. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. So I think in verses 16 and 17, he is talking about Jewish festivals, Jewish observances. So a religious festival. What festivals did they have? Passover, sure. The Feast of Booths, otherwise known as tabernacles. They had their various celebrations. In fact, there were 3 that were supposed to take place in Jerusalem every year. And not everybody went to all of them, but they went to Passover, but they definitely would go to the Feast of Booths. That was the big one in Jewish culture. We think about the Passover because it's connected with Jesus and his crucifixion. What was the other feast? Pentecost, that's right, the ingathering. And so that was a very special symbolic sense of Acts 2, where all God's covenant people have come back home. And so here he's talking about eating or drinking, and that does sound a lot like this verse from Romans 14, verse 3. Similar context. Let not the one who eats despise the one who does not eat. That's what it literally says. And let not the one who does not eat pass judgment on the one who eats. You remember us talking about this? Those of you who were in our study. So he's talking about the same kinds of issues here, but this time it's a festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. All of these are Jewish observances that are not required of us under the new covenant. You remember what Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 31 through 34. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. What does that imply then about the old covenant? It's obsolete. We are not under the old covenant. Why don't we worship and assemble on Saturday, but rather on Sunday? Well, that was the old covenant, and then we see this shift in the new covenant, where we see saints meeting on the first day of the week. Jesus was resurrected on Sunday. The church was established on Sunday. We get the point. We take the hint. These are just a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. What does he mean by that? How is the Sabbath anticipating Jesus? How much time do we have? How does the Sabbath anticipate Jesus? The Hebrew writer in Hebrews 3 and 4 talked about, they shall, quoting from Psalm 95, they shall not enter my rest. Well, Sabbath means rest. And see, so what he says throughout the sermon in Hebrews is that we are in the rest now. We are enjoying the Sabbath rest right now. And so it's a shadow. The Sabbath is a celebration of our relationship with God that exists for all of us now. It's just a shadow. The festivals, how does Pentecost point to Jesus? Well, it's the ingathering of all God's people. It's a great big celebration. How about the Feast of Booths, where the Israelites were wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, and it's commemorating that? How does that relate to Jesus? In fact, all of these are talked about in the Gospel of John, showing how Jesus is superior to these Jewish festivals, including Hanukkah, which wasn't actually commanded by God, but yet it's talked about in John 10. So, how is the Feast of Booths fulfilled in Jesus? How is the Feast of Booths anticipating the Lord?
Well, theirs was the hope of Christ is the substance.
Okay.
Reality.
So Jesus is the reality. In what way does he fulfill? In what way is he the reality of the Feast of Booths, would you say? The Feast of Tabernacles. Okay. All right. So we're no longer lost. We are no longer wandering. And throughout the wilderness wanderings, what did God do for his people? Did he leave them to fend for themselves? No, he provided for them. And so it's about trust. It's about confidence in God, reliance on him. What about the Passover then? What's the significance of the Passover for us? That's the easy one, isn't it? Jesus is the Paschal lamb that was offered. He was without blemish and no sin, and he was sacrificed for us. All of these festivals, all these observances are a shadow of the things that were to come. So do we need to be observing the Sabbath? Do we need to be celebrating the Passover or Hanukkah as Christians?
We have something better.
We have something better. Well, I'm just not spiritually fulfilled, so I need to get in contact with some of these religious festivals. Paul's saying you don't need to do that. So what he's saying is, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. And then he talks about the feasts. You aren't observing the Sabbath. Don't let anyone say, hey, you really need to be observing the Sabbath, You want to be a good Christian. And he also talked about circumcision back in verse 11. Do Gentiles need to be circumcised in order to be good Christians? Well, no. That's part of the old covenant. Yes, ma'am.
If I think that I am not, if I'm thinking that I am not spiritually fulfilled, then that means I need to study more Scripture to be fulfilled.
Okay.
To be complete.
Now,
I have that fulfillment.
in the first century, though, you had a lot of people who were Christians who had been observing the law of Moses because Jesus hadn't come yet, or they were converted soon after. And it was part of their culture. And it still is part of people's culture today. So let me ask you this. Is it wrong for a Jewish family, a Christian Jewish family, to observe the Passover? I don't think it is wrong. Is it wrong for a Christian Jewish family to not observe the Passover? I don't think it is. Don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink. And Paul discusses this in Romans 14, the same concept, 1 Corinthians 8. So is it just in Colossae where this is an issue? Where Jews are coming in and trying to influence non-Jewish folks? No, absolutely not. So do not let anyone disqualify you, look down their spiritual noses at you, and you go, I better get in line because they don't like what I'm doing. We need to look for book, chapter, verse. We need to look for where does it say in the Bible I can or cannot do this. We need to search the scriptures to see if what other people are saying is true. And you have to make the decision. I saw a hand here.
Yeah, how could this be reconciled with 1 Corinthians 8, when someone is judged by what he's doing, and for instance, we become a stumbling block to those who are weak by eating or doing whatever they disbelieve in, and we're told in 1 Corinthians
Right.
not to do that unless we be a stumbling block to those who are weak.
So here it's what you're not doing.
Yeah.
There it was what you were doing. Some people were eating meat sacrificed to idols, and Paul was saying, look, abstain from that so that you don't cause someone to stumble. Here it's people not participating in these activities. So maybe that's the difference.
Yeah, but if your friend comes to you and says, you should be observing the Sabbath, you're not a good Christian unless you are.
Right.
That's
So we would say these are matters of opinion. Of course, the problem is everybody has an opinion, and they'll think this isn't a matter of opinion. So these are some issues. But I do see the difference in 1 Corinthians 8, Romans 14. It's people doing the eating and drinking, and here it's people not doing the eating and drinking. So how do you reconcile this? Where Paul says, stop the eating and drinking, with this passage that says, continue to not eat or drink.
There's a lot of judgment required in executing these things.
Okay.
In every situation, it's probably going to be a little bit unique, but the attitude of love and looking out for our fellow Christians is going to be what guides us through that.
So is there a difference in the case of Paul, in the case of Romans 14? You have somebody over and you've got meat for them, and they go, okay, well, this is what they're serving, and it sure smells good. You got a steak there that's been aged 60 days. I'm going to make everybody hungry. It's 2 inches thick, and it's medium rare. And you're going, this has been sacrificed to an idol. I can't eat this, but boy, it smells good. I'm going to eat it. But here in Colossae, you're saying, I'm not observing your festivals or your celebrations. It is a matter of conscience. It's a matter for you to not be judged, not allow yourself to be judged. All right, I'm going to move on to Colossians 2:18 and 19. So we had Jewish festivals in verses 16 and 17. Take a look at verses 18 and 19 and tell me what you think here. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism. Some of you may have humility there. We'll talk about that. And worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. So we're moving into verses 18 and 19. Tell me about asceticism. Is that something that you see commanded in the Old Testament? Refraining from eating, if that's the correct translation here. Or the worship of angels. Where are we commanded to worship angels in the Old Testament or New Testament? In fact, when John, in the vision of Revelation, falls down to worship an angel, what does the angel say to him? Twice. Get up. You need to worship God, not me. What about Jesus, though? When people would fall down and worship him, what did he say? No. Stop doing that. He didn't, because he is God. Don't let anyone disqualify you. I love words like this when you look across the English translation spectrum and you see it is all translated differently. It's just fascinating to me because it's one word. What does it mean? And it's just hard sometimes to convey it into another language, or there are nuances that need to be considered. And so here are some reputable translations, some more reputable than others, we might say. Disqualify, English Standard Version, the New International Version, defraud. Don't let anyone defraud you. Is that the same thing as disqualify? Defraud? Okay. Condemn. Cheat. King James, beguile you. So which is it? There's some different nuances here. Yes, sir, Robert.
Mine actually says, let no one rob you of the prize.
Okay, so cheat and beguile probably would, or defraud would go along with that. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't the word, if we just use the word qualify, doesn't that determine a measurement of something?
Okay.
And if the measurement is purity, disqualifying is take you away from that which is real, purposeful, and pure.
So what somebody is doing is pulling you away from Jesus. Notice what he says about Jesus here in verse 19. So we're not there yet. But what people are doing is they're insisting on asceticism. The word is actually humility. And so in some translations, they render it as false humility, insisting on false humility and worship of angels. And so people will talk about the visions that they've seen, and they're puffed up without reason. They don't have any reason to be puffed up. So asceticism. This word is translated just a handful of times. It appears a handful of times in the New Testament. And everywhere else except Colossians 2:18 and 23, it is translated as humility. So what you're going to need to do is make a decision about what you think this term means. And how interesting it is that it's just a different word. Yes, ma'am.
I have self-abasement.
Self-abasement, okay.
And I can, in that particular area,
Yeah.
that one, I think of the scribes and the Pharisees and whatnot in the markets. You know, they puff themselves up, and they do I've been fasting and that kind of thing. I do see
Okay.
that one particular part in them.
So how do the pagans do that? If in fact verses 18 and 19 are talking about pagan practices.
Self-whippings and
Okay.
things of that nature too.
Yes, sir?
Well, the other word, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead,
The
and
other words
I'm
that are
telling
used,
Robbins next.
Asceticism don't quite get to the basis of asceticism. Asceticism is usually, almost always, self-imposed, something that you did on your own. So you're worshiping an angel. Nobody told us to do that. That's self-imposed. Visions puffed up with beyond reason, your sensuous mind. This is all from self. This is not from things that you've heard from the commandments of God.
Yes, sir.
In verse 23, asceticism is mentioned again.
Yes.
The severity of the body.
Severity of, in association with severity of the body. And so that's why the English Standard Version and NIV are saying, hey, this is not about humility, it's about withholding from yourself food and drink.
The other thing I want to say is this thing in verse 6, I guess it's 16, about being disqualified, let no one disqualify you. Back in chapter 1 verse 12, it says our Father has qualified us.
Okay.
We become qualified, but we can also be disqualified.
Very good. So chapter 2, verse 12 talks about being disqualified. Wait a minute. You said chapter 1, verse 12 talks about being qualified, and then that links up with being disqualified. Don't let anyone disqualify you. So who's doing the disqualification? Who's causing it to happen? You are. It's passive. It's you who are allowing yourself to be disqualified. Do you remember another famous passage where Paul talks about disqualification? Yeah, I buffet my body, buffet my body daily, 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27, and I run the race so as to win. Why? Because lest I myself should be disqualified. Disqualified. That would make a great sermon right there. What does it mean to be qualified by God? What are some passages that describe that? I can think of several. And so that may be coming to you in a sermon near you very soon. So asceticism, it has something to do with the body. The worship of angels, you most certainly don't see that in the Old Testament. The practice of worshiping angels, at least it's not commended. It's condemned. Going on about visions. Remember Paul saw this lofty vision. I know a man in the flesh who he describes this heavenly vision, and then what was given to Paul to keep him humble, interestingly? The thorn in the flesh, which means he got married. No, that's not right. We don't know what the thorn in the flesh is. We have no idea what it means. So people are looking for something else than Jesus. They're looking, looking for love in all the wrong places. They're looking for satisfaction in all the wrong places. So You aren't, verse 18, you aren't insisting on all these things that are pagan practices, and instead you are holding fast to the head, which they are not doing. So they're promoting something that does not relate to Jesus. So earlier, he talked about Jesus being the head. Chapter 2, verse 10, that's why I mentioned that verse. You have been filled in him who is the head of all rule and authority. And so here Paul is saying the opposite, but he's implying to us we need to hold fast to the head. Let me tell you about this head. From whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. Holding fast to the head. We are in the head. The head is within us. Jesus is sustaining us, nourishing us, and we're growing with a growth that is from God. Is there another passage that you can think of that uses this idea of the body and Jesus being the head and being nourished and knit together and growing? Ephesians 4, 15, and 16. So something I will continue to do is try to point out the parallels, the so-called parallels between Colossians and Ephesians. And I'll remind you that Paul wrote Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians all around the same time. Philemon is the man who hosted a church in his home. He was obviously a rich man. And Philemon's runaway slave Onesimus is one of the people bearing the letter Colossians to Colossae. But then it seems afterwards, I think Colossians was first. Don't know, but Ephesians probably is obviously very closely connected. Now, is Paul addressing the same situation in Colossae that he is in Ephesus? No, every later situational, Paul talks about some similar concepts, but he's addressing different issues. And here it's the Colossian heresy. And so in Ephesians, he talks about us growing up in every way in him who is the head, into Christ. That's who I'm talking about. From whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint, and then Paul talked about ligaments in the other text, with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, making the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. What was the situation at Ephesus? You had a lot of Jews and you had a lot of Gentiles, and they were not getting along. So here he's not simply talking about the body growing and knowing Christ and not giving into syncretism and other false teachings. Here he's talking about the body growing up in love, being joined together, preserving the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, Ephesians 4, verse 3, forgiving each other, Ephesians 4, verse 32. So that there's a lot of similarity between these letters. So, as we close this right here, let's think about verses 16 and 17 again. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. So in light of our study, what do you think these verses are talking about? The Jewish celebrations are fulfilled in Jesus. We don't need to be focused on them anymore. And then in verses 18 and 19, do not let anyone disqualify you. This is you letting them take you away from the head, which is the source of our life. And when we cut ourselves off from the head, what happens? As Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12. If part of the body says, well, I'm no good, I'm not part of the body, and you cut it off, what's going to happen to that body part? It's going to wither and die. What's going to happen to the rest of the body? It's going to continue to grow. So don't let anyone disqualify you. Similar contexts, but not exactly the same. Every letter Paul wrote is situational. So don't let anyone pass judgment on you. Don't let anyone disqualify you. So let's take a look at these verses now. I'm going to read them 20 through 23, verses 20 through 23, and then we'll discuss them. Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
Ordinarily you think of disqualification as being like abject moral sin, like adultery,
Right.
all those things. This is just a change of the worship. So you can be disqualified if you do other things that are not authorized in the scriptures in the practice of religion.
Okay. And what Paul is going to talk about now is how that does affect us in our daily lives, and it becomes sin. So let's think about that. So that's excellent. That is an excellent point. Paul is talking more about our religious practices, our worship, but it affects how we live our lives. And so a lot of times we will say, well, Colossians 1 and 2 is the doctrinal part, chapters 3 and 4 are the practical part. I think it actually begins, the practical part begins here in verse 20. Because look at verse 20. It says, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world. And then look at chapter 3, verse 1. If then you have been raised with Christ. Now, in both of those, he's not saying, well, I don't know if you died to the elemental spirits. I'm not sure that you did. He's saying, because you have. You have died to the elemental spirits of the world in Christ. You have been raised with Christ in chapter 3, verse 1. So I think the practical section is beginning here. It's kind of a bridge. So I think verses 20 through 23 are the bridge between the doctrinal section that is typical in Paul's letters and then the practical section. So in Romans, what was the doctrinal section of Romans? There's 16 chapters. When does the practical section begin? Chapter 12. Therefore I beseech you that you offer yourself as a sacrifice to God, which is your holy and reasonable service, logical service. What do we typically say about Ephesians? Chapters 1 through 3 are the doctrinal. Chapters 4 through 6 are the practical. Colossians 1 and 2 doctrinal, 3 and 4 practical. But maybe we could include these verses in the practical section as well. All right, got about 7 or 8 minutes left. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, and you have, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. Now, I'm reading that with a lot of force here. Do you think it's justified? Do you think Paul has just raised the rhetoric here a little bit? Turned up the heat? Why? These indeed have an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and, here's the repeat of the term, asceticism, and severity of the body. And so that's why Rob's saying, I think it is asceticism here in Colossians. In this context, maybe in the others it's humility. Here it's talking about people not eating or drinking or trying to do some religious observance by refraining from eating at all, anything. And people did that in the Greco-Roman world. People do that still. Severity to the body. But they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. So why would people refrain from eating? Why did you have the Stoics who didn't want to show any emotion? They're just stoic. Why? Because they didn't want to give in to fleshly desires. They didn't want to become corrupt in light of Greco-Roman culture. And what does Paul say? Doing that is of no value. Doing that does not stop the indulgence of the flesh. we're supposed to be living our lives in accordance with the gospel, and the gospel does not hurt us. It enhances our lives. Reuben.
We see that Daniel would set aside time 3 times a day to get on his hands, to get on his knees, and
Face Jerusalem.
face Jerusalem and focus on praying to God. I would imagine if something were to pretty much, what I'm trying to say is, if something were to get in the way of that, he'd probably go crazy.
Yeah. Right, and that's why he continued, even after he was told not to.
I mean, that was his, I mean, he did that. It's not saying that everybody did that. He did that.
That's right. And he gives us inspiration.
So I can't imagine him not doing that, is what I'm saying. So as a Christian, it's like we live a life of being Christians and being holy. Wouldn't it bother us if something got in the way of us not being able to perform?
That's the way it should be. Yes, sir.
When I think of severity of the body, I think of what Jesus said, if your eye offends you, pluck it out.
Okay.
There could be people that took that literally and shot things off. I also think about that movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they were self-flagellating. They were walking along chanting and whipping themselves.
Yeah,
You haven't seen that, have you?
I have, many times. Yes, sir. That's why I turned out the way I am.
By the 2nd century,
I'm going to put you on over my shoulders and say, bring out your dead. Bring out your dead. Go ahead.
by the 2nd century, there were a group of people, and it probably started earlier, called the Manichaeans, who would perform amputations on themselves, who did engage in like body modification in order to
Be more holy or
right
in service to
and
God.
They were Christians. They were doing this specifically because of the stuff Christ said in the Gospels, but they interpreted that very very literally and in a very extreme way.
I was forced to read. Did I see a hand over here? Cody? Is that a hand? No. Remember the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne, and the person beating himself up because he had committed adultery, or he had the child with, was her name Charity? Is that her name? Anyway, I'm told that Hawthorne may have exaggerated the Puritan way of life, but apparently that's what people did. I hope none of us take Jesus literally and cut off our hand or pluck out our eye or cut off our foot. But isn't it brilliant of Jesus, those expressions, because it really gets your attention. It's hyperbole. He's not being literal. And so what are people doing here? They are recognizing that there are false teachers out there, and I must not let them influence me because I have the real deal. I have the one who is the head of all the world. So that's why, and I think it's so brilliant that Paul began by looking at Colossians 1:15 through 23, talking about the real deal, the preeminence of Christ, the incomparable Jesus. In my Bible, I've got an introduction, and I think it'll reinforce what we're studying right now. Paul wrote to the church in Colossae to fortify that church against false teachers who might try to impose strict rules about eating and drinking and religious festivals. We just studied that, didn't we? Paul shows the superiority of Christ over all human philosophies and traditions. And what I'm emphasizing right now is he shows that first. He shows us what Jesus is first. He writes of Christ's deity. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation, chapter 1, verse 15. And he also talks about the reconciliation he accomplished with his blood. Remember us talking about that a couple weeks ago. And then he's going to talk about the right way of living in this world. It's to focus on heavenly things rather than earthly things. And that's what we'll be looking at next week. So today we looked at verses 16 through 23. Don't let anyone disqualify you. Don't let anyone pass judgment on you. And what we're going to be looking at in 2 weeks is what is most certainly the part of this practical section. So probably we should just say the practical section starts in chapter 3. That's fine with me. And we're going to cover 17 verses. So you've got 2 weeks to prep for our study, and I look forward to studying that with you. By the way, I'm going to be in Orange, Texas. I'm going to be working with a church, Mauriceville, for their vacation Bible school. And I'll be doing the adult class, not the little kids class. So I don't get to roll the gospel chariot. Next Sunday, Reuben is going to preach for us. And then the following Sunday, we got a unique situation. There's a young man who just started preaching at the beginning of the year for Senton, Borden Street. His name is Hunter Allen. He and his wife are going to be here in 2 weeks from today. So y'all be nice to him. He's a young man just getting going. And don't scare him. No, I know y'all will enjoy Reuben and Hunter over the next 2 weeks. You have to put up with me this morning, though. Thank you. Thank you very much.